She was the best nurse in the hospital, but she died 12 years ago.
Armed soldiers stormed the hospital to save their captain until a dead nurse saved him instead.
Blood on the linoleum is a familiar sight in any high-volume trauma ward, but the woman wiping the sweat from dying patients' brows never left footprints in it. She worked the graveyard shift for years, a quiet angel of mercy. Nobody questioned her until heavily armed men stormed the lobby. The air inside St. Jude's Medical Center at 3 a.m. always felt distinctly different from the rest of the day. Located in the gritty heart of downtown Chicago, the Level 1 Trauma Center was a revolving door of human misery, accidents, and violence. During the day, the hospital was a chaotic symphony of shouting doctors, crying relatives, and paging intercoms. But during the graveyard shift, specifically the dead hours between 2 a.m. and 5 a.m., a heavy, suffocating stillness would settle over the ER, punctuated only by the sudden, terrifying scream of ambulance sirens. Dr. Asher Aris, a seasoned trauma, attending with bags under his eyes that mirrored bruised plums, practically lived in this nocturnal purgatory. He had seen everything the city could throw at a human body, and over his 12 years at St. Jude's, he had learned to rely on a tight-knit crew of night shift veterans. Among them was a nurse named Eleanor Wright. At least, that was the name Asher assumed was hers. In the perpetual blur of understaffed night shifts, where agency nurses and float pool temps rotated through the wards like ghosts, Eleanor was a constant stabilizing presence. She was undeniably striking, though not in a conventional way. She was pale, almost luminous under the harsh fluorescent lights, with dark hair pinned meticulously beneath a white nursing cap that looked a decade out of date. She wore crisp, snow-white scrubs that never seemed to stain, no matter how much arterial spray painted Trauma Bay 1. What Asher found most peculiar about Eleanor wasn't her outdated uniform, but her demeanor. She was extraordinarily soft-spoken. Her voice rarely rose above a whisper, yet it possessed a resonant, commanding quality that cut through the panic of a crashing patient. "She's an odd one, isn't she?" Brenda Higgins, the veteran charge nurse, muttered to Asher one rainy Tuesday night. They were standing behind the nurse's station, sipping bitter, lukewarm coffee. Brenda nodded toward the end of the hallway, where Eleanor was slipping into the room of a critical burn victim. "I tried to find her in the HR scheduling system yesterday to approve her overtime. The system kept throwing an error code. I figure she's one of those high-tier private agency contractors administration brings in when we're desperate." Asher took a slow sip of his coffee. "Whoever she works for, I'm glad she's here. Did you see her during that 10-car pileup on the I-90 last month? She secured an airway on a crushed trachea before I even had the intubation kit open." "She didn't even flinch, that's the thing," Brenda whispered, leaning closer. "She doesn't flinch, she doesn't sweat. And Asher, have you ever touched her hands?" Asher frowned. "What do you mean?" "Last week she handed me a bag of O-negative blood. Her fingers brushed mine, Asher. She was freezing, like ice water cold. I asked her if she felt ill, and she just gave me this sad, gentle smile and walked away." Before Asher could process Brenda's observation, the red emergency phone on the wall shrieked to life. The bat phone, the direct line from EMS dispatch. Brenda snatched it up. Her hardened features immediately tightened into a grim mask. "ETA 2 minutes, Brenda barked, slamming the receiver down. "Multiple gunshot wounds, severe hemorrhage. The paramedics are doing CPR, but they're losing him. They say it's a gang-related drive-by. Kid is only 19. The familiar rush of adrenaline flooded Asher's veins. "Get Trauma Bay 1 ready, page Doctor Evans and the surgical team. Let's move." When the paramedics burst through the double doors, the scene was sheer bedlam. The young patient was exsanguinating, the gurney soaked in a terrifying amount of crimson. Dr. Sarah Evans, the chief surgical resident, was already barking orders as they transferred the boy to the hospital bed. Monitors shrieked a high-pitched, erratic rhythm, warning that his heart was giving out. "He's crashing! V-fib!" Sarah yelled, grabbing the defibrillator paddles. "Charge to 200! Clear!" The boy's body arched off the table, but the monitor remained a jagged, hopeless line. "Push 1 milligram of epinephrine," Asher ordered. his hands slick with blood as he desperately tried to pack the primary wound in the boy's abdomen. "Come on, kid. Stay with us." They worked frantically. The room was a cacophony of desperate shouts and the relentless, flatlining wail of the heart monitor. Asher could feel the boy's life slipping through his fingers. It was a feeling he hated, a cold void opening up right there in the brightly lit room. Then, the ambient temperature in the trauma bay seemed to plummet. Eleanor stepped up to the head of the bed. Asher hadn't even seen her enter. She didn't announce her presence. She simply materialized beside the boy's head. While the rest of the team was frantically pumping chests and pushing drugs, Eleanor leaned down, placing her pale, bare hands gently on either side of the teenager's blood-splattered face. She leaned in, her lips almost touching his ear. Asher couldn't hear what she said. It was a murmur, a vibration of sound that seemed to bypass the ears and settle directly in the bones. Instantly, the erratic screaming of the monitor hitched, then a steady beep, then another. "We have a pulse," Sarah gasped, staring at the screen in disbelief. "Pressure is coming up. 60 over 40, 70 over 50. Hess stabilizing." Asher stared at Eleanor. She didn't look at him. She simply smoothed the boy's hair, her dark eyes filled with a profound, ancient sorrow. As the surgical team rushed the stabilized patient out the doors toward the OR, Asher turned to thank her, but Trauma Bay 1 was empty. Eleanor was gone, leaving no trace she had ever been there, save for the fact that the dying boy was still breathing. Asher looked down at the floor. In the frantic shuffle, everyone had tracked bloody footprints across the white tiles. Every set of footprints belonged to Asher, Sarah, and the paramedics. There was not a single footprint where Eleanor had stood. 3 months passed. The strange incident in Trauma Bay 1 became just another ghost story in a hospital already full of them. Asher tried to rationalize it. He was sleep-deprived. The lighting was bad. Eleanor must have stepped carefully. But every time he saw her gliding silently through the corridors, fixing 4 drips or comforting crying families, a chill crawled up his spine. She never ate in the break room. She never swiped an ID badge to open secure doors. She simply waited until someone else opened them, slipping through like a shadow. Then came the night of November 14th. It was 3:15 a.m. A heavy sleet was battering the hospital windows. The ER was uncharacteristically quiet, lulling the staff into a false sense of security. Asher was at the front desk charting when the glass automatic doors to the ambulance bay didn't just open. They were violently shoved off their tracks. "Get out of the way! Clear the hall!" A squad of heavily armed men, in full tactical gear, wearing unmarked black uniforms, swarmed into the lobby. They carried matte black assault rifles, their faces concealed behind balaclavas and night vision mounts. The remaining hospital staff froze in absolute terror. A tall man with a silver buzz cut, wearing a dark trench coat over his tactical vest, stepped forward. He flashed a badge so quickly Asher couldn't read the agency, only the imposing federal seal. "I need your best trauma surgeon right now," the man barked, his voice gravelly and brooking no argument. "This hospital is now under federal lockdown. Nobody in, nobody out. We have a condition crimson. I'm the attending physician, Dr. Aris," Asher said, stepping forward, his heart hammering against his ribs. "What do you have?" 2 more tactical operators pushed a heavy military stretcher through the ruined doors. The man on it was massive, easily 240 lb of pure muscle, heavily tattooed, and currently bleeding from half a dozen catastrophic wounds. He was wearing shredded desert camouflage. "Captain John Donovan," the commander said, his eyes burning with intense urgency. "JSOC, he took 2 rounds to the chest, 1 to the femoral artery, and caught shrapnel from an IED. We clamped the artery in the chopper, but Hess bleeding out internally. Save him, doctor." "That's an order." They rushed Donovan into Trauma Bay 1. The sheer presence of the Black Ops team in the room, 4 men standing guard with rifles at the ready, made the already tense atmosphere almost unbreathable. Asher and Dr. Sarah Evans went to work, but the situation was immediately disastrous. Donovan's chest cavity was filling with blood. The bullet had shattered a rib and likely nicked his aorta. "We need to crack his chest." "Get the saw!" Asher yelled, his voice cracking. "Blood bank. We need massive transfusion protocol stat. Send up all the O negative you have." "His pressure is tanking," "30 over palp," Sarah cried out, her hands slick as she struggled to maintain traction on the bleeding leg wound. The military commander grabbed Asher by the shoulder, his grip like a vice. "You do not let him die, Doc. He has intelligence that could save thousands of lives. He stays alive, do you hear me?" "I'm trying," Asher yelled back, shoving the commander's hand off, "but that's practically empty. I can't fix him if he has no blood." The monitor let out a long, continuous, terrifying tone. "Flatline, snorts, starting compressions," Sarah shouted, climbing onto a stool to get leverage over the massive soldier's chest. "Hold your fire." A soft, impossibly calm voice echoed through the bay. The tactical operators instantly raised their weapons, scanning the room for the source of the unauthorized voice. The commander unholstered his sidearm, pivoting sharply. Eleanor Wright was standing at the foot of the stretcher. Asher blinked. He hadn't seen her come in. The operators guarding the only door looked at each other in bewildered panic. They hadn't let anyone pass them. "Who the hell are you?" "Step away from the captain," the commander roared, leveling his pistol at Eleanor's chest. Eleanor completely ignored the weapon. She didn't even look at the armed men. She walked gracefully to the side of the bed, her white uniform a stark contrast to the blood-soaked chaos. She gently pushed Sarah aside. The resident, usually fiercely protective of her patients, inexplicably stepped back, her eyes wide, entirely compliant. Eleanor placed her pale hands directly over the massive gaping wound in Donovan's chest. "What is she doing?" "Shoot her!" one of the operators yelled, but the commander held up a hand, his eyes widening. The blood that had been violently welling out of Donovan's chest suddenly stopped. It didn't clot. It just ceased flowing, as if an invisible tourniquet had been applied to his very soul. Eleanor leaned down until her face was inches from the dying soldier's pale, sweaty face. She closed her eyes. "John," she whispered. The sound carried across the room, crystal clear over the drone of the medical equipment. "The extraction chopper is waiting. You don't get to rest yet. On your feet, soldier," for a horrifying, agonizing 3 seconds. Nothing happened. Then Captain John Donovan's eyes snapped open. They weren't the unfocused, rolling eyes of a dying man. They were sharp, intensely lucid, and fixed directly on Eleanor's face. He drew in a massive, ragged breath that sounded like tearing canvas. The heart monitor suddenly spiked. Beep, beep, beep. Strong. Regular. Impossible. Donovan reached up with a trembling, blood-stained hand and gently gripped Eleanor's pristine, white sleeve. A look of profound awe washed over his hardened, battle-scarred face. "Valkyrie," he rasped, his voice thick with blood and disbelief. You came back for me." Eleanor offered him a smile so gentle it made Asher's chest ache. "I never left, John, but you have to stay here a little longer." She gently pulled her arm away from his grasp. She stepped back from the bed, turning her dark eyes toward Asher. "He is stable, doctor. The internal bleeding has ceased. You may proceed with the surgery." Asher was frozen, his mind completely incapable of processing the medical impossibility he had just witnessed. A man with a severed aorta does not just stabilize. He does not wake up. "Secure her," the commander barked, snapping out of his shock. 2 operators lunged forward to grab Eleanor, but as they reached for her arms, Asher blinked. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered violently, buzzing with a sharp surge of electricity. When the lights steadied a fraction of a second later, the operator's hands grasped only empty air. Eleanor Wright was gone. The operators stumbled into each other, looking around the small, enclosed trauma bay in absolute bewilderment. There was nowhere to hide. The doors hadn't opened. "Where did she go?" the commander demanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous, terrified low. He grabbed Asher by the scruffs. "Who the hell was that woman?" Asher stared at the empty space where she had stood, then down at the floor. "No footprints." He swallowed hard, his mouth bone dry. That was Eleanor," Asher whispered. "She's one of our nurses, from the stretcher." Captain Donovan coughed, a weak laugh bubbling up from his chest as Sarah frantically began prepping him for the surgical suite. "Nurse," Donovan wheezed, his eyes staring at the ceiling, a look of absolute reverence on his face. "Doc, that wasn't a nurse. That was First Lieutenant Evelyn Cross. She was the chief combat medic for my unit in Kandahar." The commander went completely rigid, the blood draining from his face. "Donovan, you're hallucinating from blood loss. Lieutenant Cross is dead. She was killed in action 12 years ago. The silence left in the wake of Eleanor's disappearance was heavier than the storm raging outside. In Trauma Bay 1, surrounded by discarded gauze, pools of crimson, and the rhythmic, steady beeping of a heart monitor that should have been flatlining, Dr. Asher Aris and the heavily armed tactical team simply stared at the empty space at the foot of the stretcher. Commander Vance, a man whose files listed dozens of lethal Black Ops missions across the globe, lowered his sidearm. His hands, clad in reinforced tactical gloves, were visibly shaking. "Get him to surgery," Vance finally rasped, his voice devoid of its earlier commanding bark. Now, as Dr. Sarah Evans and the surgical team hurriedly wheeled the stabilized Captain Donovan out of the bay, Vance turned to Asher. The commander's eyes were wide, haunted by a ghost he clearly recognized, but refused to accept. "Dr. Aris," Vance said, his tone low and dangerous, "I need a secure room, and I need to see your employee records. Every single file you have on this Eleanor Wright." 10 minutes later, Asher sat across from Vance in the cramped, windowless hospital administration office. The federal lockdown was still in full effect. Tactical operators stood guard at every exit, their rifles strapped across their chests. Vance had unclasped his heavy ballistic vest and placed a secured, military-grade laptop on the desk. "I ran her fingerprints through the national database when she started here 3 years ago," Asher explained, typing his credentials into the hospital's HR terminal. "It came back with a standard agency clearance. Nothing unusual, because it was a ghost profile," Vance muttered, typing furiously on his own encrypted terminal, a placeholder created by the Department of Defense to track anomalies. "Look at this." Vance turned his screen toward Asher. On it was a scanned military dossier. The header read, "Cross, Evelyn, First Lieutenant, Medical Corps, Kia." Attached to the file was a photograph of a woman in desert camouflage, standing outside a canvas medical tent. She looked younger, her skin tanned by the brutal Middle Eastern sun, but the features were unmistakable. The dark, piercing eyes, the gentle, melancholic smile, the profound sense of calm radiating from the image. It was Eleanor Shiva. She wasn't just a combat medic, Vance said, his voice thick with a grief he had clearly buried for over a decade. Evelyn Cross was a legend in the Joint Special Operations Command. They called her the Valkyrie. She had this terrifying habit of walking directly into active firefights without a weapon, just her medical kit, to drag wounded operators out of the kill zone. She never lost a patient. Not one. Asher stared at the photograph, his mind reeling. "Commander, I've worked alongside this woman for 3 years. We've shared coffee. She handed me surgical instruments. How is this possible?" "I don't know," Vance whispered, rubbing his face. "But I know how she died." Vance pulled up a heavily redacted mission report. 12 years ago, Firebase Viper, Kandahar Province. Our unit was overrun by insurgents during a midnight raid. It was a massacre. The order was given to evacuate the medical tents before the perimeter collapsed. Everyone fell back except Evelyn. Asher leaned forward, his heart pounding against his ribs. "Why?" "Because she had a 19-year-old private on her operating table," Vance said, his voice cracking. The kid had taken shrapnel to his femoral artery. If she moved him, or if she let go of the pressure she was applying to the wound, he would bleed out in seconds. The medevac chopper pilots screamed at her to board. She refused. She told them to leave without her. The room grew suffocatingly cold. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered briefly, a haunting echo of the trauma bay. When the quick reaction force finally retook the base the next morning, Vance continued, swallowing hard. They found the medical tent riddled with bullet holes. Evelyn was dead. She had taken 4 rounds to the back, but Vance paused, wiping a stray tear from his hardened cheek. Her hands were still clamped down on that young private's artery. Even in death, her grip was so tight they had to pry her fingers away. She saved him. Asher felt the blood drain from his face as the pieces of the puzzle slammed together. That 19-year-old private was John Donovan, Vance confirmed, nodding slowly, the man currently lying in your operating room. He owed his life to her. He dedicated his entire military career to honoring her sacrifice. And tonight, when he was dying again, she came back to finish the job. Asher finished, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. He quickly pivoted to his own keyboard, Pulling up the deep archived employment records of St. Jude's Medical Center, he bypassed the current agency temp files and dug into the historical data from the early 2000s. After a few tense minutes of searching, a PDF document loaded on his screen. It was an old hospital badge photo. "Commander," Asher whispered, pointing at the screen. "Look, before enlisting in the Army in 2006, Evelyn Cross had been a civilian trauma nurse. Her assigned workplace, NT, Jude's Medical Center, her assigned schedule, the graveyard shift. She hadn't just returned for Donovan. When her earthly life was violently cut short, the Valkyrie had simply returned to the only other place she knew how to save lives. She'd been haunting the halls of St. Jude's for a decade, a guardian angel trapped in the witching hour, endlessly repeating her duty. By 5:30 a.m., the brutal sleet storm had broken, giving way to a pale, bruised sunrise over the Chicago skyline. The hospital remained under condition crimson, but the frantic energy of the night had dissolved into a heavy, reverent exhaustion. Captain John Donovan had survived the surgery. Dr. Evans had managed to repair the severed aorta and stabilize the femoral bleed. It was, medically speaking, a miraculous outcome. Donovan was resting in a secured glass-walled room in the intensive care unit. Asher and Commander Vance stood in the hallway outside, holding cheap styrofoam cups of coffee. 6 tactical operators lined the corridor, their weapons resting securely against their tactical vests. Their postures relaxed but vigilant. "We're lifting the lockdown in 20 minutes, Vance said quietly, staring through the glass at his sleeping captain. "Medevac is en route. We're taking him to Walter Reed. The intelligence he has. It's going to dismantle a major terror network. Thousands of lives will be saved because he lived tonight." Asher nodded slowly, and because she saved him, again, suddenly, the ambient temperature in the ICU plummeted. It wasn't a subtle chill. The sudden drop in temperature was violent enough to make Asher's breath visible in the air. A thin layer of white frost rapidly crawled across the glass walls of Donovan's room, crackling softly in the quiet corridor. The tactical operators immediately tensed, their hands flying to their rifles. "Stand down," Vance barked, his voice echoing loudly. "Lower your weapons. That is a direct order." The men hesitated, but slowly lowered their muzzles toward the floor. At the far end of the hallway, the shadow detached itself from the wall. She didn't materialize. She simply stepped out of the periphery of their vision. Evelyn Cross, still wearing her pristine white, outdated nursing uniform, walked slowly down the center of the corridor. The heavy combat boots of the operators shuffled nervously, but no one dared speak. As she walked past Asher and Vance, the scent of sterile iodine and ozone filled the air. She didn't look at them. Her dark, sorrowful eyes were fixed entirely on the man sleeping in the hospital bed. The heavy glass door to the ICU room swung open on its own, its hinges completely silent. Evelyn stepped inside. Asher and Vance stepped up to the frosted glass, wiping away a small circle of ice to peer inside. Donovan was awake, despite the tubes and wires tethering him to the mortal world. He turned his head slowly to look at the apparition standing beside his bed. The hardened, scarred soldier looked like a frightened child. Tears pooled in his eyes and rolled down his temples into his pillow. Evelyn reached out, her pale, luminous hand hovering just an inch above his forehead. She didn't touch him this time. She didn't need to. Through the glass, Asher could read her lips perfectly. "My watch is over, Captain. Live a good life." Donovan nodded weakly, his jaw trembling as he mouthed the words, "Thank you, Lieutenant." Evelyn offered him that same gentle, melancholic smile, but this time, the sorrow was gone. She looked radiant, unburdened, and entirely at peace. She turned away from the bed and walked back toward the glass door. As she stepped out into the hallway, Commander Vance squared his shoulders. The combat-hardened veteran stood rigidly straight, his heels snapping together with a sharp crack that echoed down the corridor. "Detail, attention!" Vance roared. Instantly, the 6 heavily armed Black Ops operators snapped into perfect, rigid posture. Present arms. In perfect unison, the tactical unit raised their right hands in a crisp, razor-sharp military salute. Vance held his salute tightly, his eyes burning with unshed tears, staring straight ahead as the ghost of the Valkyrie walked past him. Asher stood frozen, witnessing a squad of the deadliest men on the planet paying their ultimate respects to a soft-spoken ER nurse. Evelyn didn't stop, but as she reached the end of the hallway, she turned her head slightly toward Commander Vance. She raised her own hand, returning the salute with perfect military precision. Then the first rays of morning sunlight pierced through the window at the end of the hall. The golden light struck her white uniform, and in the blink of an eye, she dissolved. There was no dramatic flash, no lingering shadows. She simply fractured into a million motes of glowing dust that danced in the morning sunbeams before vanishing completely. The frost on the glass melted instantly. The temperature returned to normal. The heavy, oppressive weight that had hung over St. Jude's Medical Center all night lifted. Vance slowly lowered his hand. The operators followed suit, exhaling collective breaths they hadn't realized they were holding. "Dismissed," Vance whispered. Later that morning, as the black helicopters lifted off from the hospital roof, carrying Captain Donovan away to safety, Asher sat alone in the break room. He looked at the empty chair in the corner where Eleanor, Evelyn, usually sat in silence, while the rest of the staff complained about the grueling night shift. She never appeared again. The graveyard shifts at St. Jude's returned to their normal, chaotic rhythm. Patients crashed. Lives were saved. And lives were lost. But whenever the monitor began to flatline, and the cold grip of death threatened to pull a patient away, Dr. Asher Aris would catch himself looking over his shoulder, waiting for a soft-spoken angel in a pristine white uniform to step out of the shadows. She never did. Evelyn Cross had finally completed her tour of duty. Her final mission accomplished, but the legend of the Valkyrie of St. Jude's would echo through the trauma wards forever. If this story sent shivers down your spine and kept you on the edge of your seat, don't let the legend of the Valkyrie end here. Hit that like button to honor heroes everywhere. Share this video with your friends who love a supernatural twist, and subscribe to our channel for more incredible real-life ghost stories. Stay spooky.